IEPs are, I was just talking about how they're challenging because you're advocating for your child's disability to people who are spending time with them when they may be trying their hardest. And when we're talking about an invisible disability like fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, it's dynamic, so it changes from day to day. And because FASD is so not really known about, in our head, when we think FASD, we think the children of alcoholics, when realistically it's incredibly common, affecting 5% of the population. But also it really causes very little alcohol to cause long-lasting effects with kids. And so we have a stigma around it. And so we have the stigma that affects the parents involved, but also the kids. And because of its dynamic nature, we may be able to pay attention really closely one day. And so that looks like we can all the time, and we don't want to some of the time. And so we see attention challenges that look like ADHD, but this is more than that. When our receptive language isn't as good, then we seem like we understand because our expressive language may be good, but there's a gap in how we're understanding things. A processing speed, taking stuff even from the board to the paper you're working on is a lot of brain skills. And so when you're trying to communicate that to people who are seeing very concrete situations that are happening in school, whereas you're okay, but when we're at home, this is what's happening. And so I'm digging down deep. Or you've had the time to do all the research. I love to train teachers whenever I can, because they're always what? But yeah. It's a tough crowd to get in front of. So, I watched your talk the other day, and you are a parent of a child with a disability and were a teacher and then became a lawyer because of your IEP experiences. So from that experience and your legal degree, of which most of us don't have, what are some of your best tips for parents who are advocating for kids with invisible disabilities?
Yeah, awesome. First, Aubrey, thank you so much for having me on today. I love having the opportunity to speak with other parents, and I find your page just so informative. And so I love what you're doing. Keep doing it. It's so important. There's not enough resources out there for parents. And so I was definitely honored when you invited me to be on today.
Okay, well, as honored as you are, I also did not introduce you. So Nkoyo, sorry, from the FEM firm, and you own your own law firm, is that correct?
That's correct.
And you were specifically an education lawyer. I talked about you a little bit before you came on, but
yeah.
So sorry, go ahead.
No, it's perfect. So yeah, advocating for children with invisible disabilities. This is absolutely has been my journey for 12 years with my own son, who's presents as if he's quote unquote normal or typical. So we had a lot of conversations about he refuses to do, when it's actually, he has some social skills deficits that make it difficult for him to interpret what's going on in certain situations. He fixates. So you might think that, you've moved on from a topic, but it's bothering him, so he's not moving on. And whatever you say, it's not, he needs to resolve that thing first, which is a part of his exceptionality. And so I think one of the first things that I will say to any parent or caregiver who is advocating for a child with invisible disabilities is to keep speaking up. We have to often remind the educators in the room that our children learn and behave differently. And so I think one of the things that's really important is getting as much knowledge as you can about your child's specific exceptionality. And I use the term exceptionality over disability just because I feel like sometimes when we talk about disabilities, we frame it in a negative way, and we don't think about all of the gifts and talents that our children bring, and we just focus on the things that they can't do. And there's so much more than the different areas where they're limited or where they are learning or behaving differently. So I often make sure in meetings, I would also say to one, know as much as you can about your child's particular diagnosis and how it presents for them, because, every child is different. For example, I have a child who's on the autism spectrum. Other children on the spectrum have certain abilities or, other limited abilities that are different from my child. So just because someone's this child has ADHD, so we're just going to assume that they do all of these things this way, it doesn't necessarily show up that way. There's a lot of differences between even genders around how certain exceptionalities present. So I would encourage you to learn as much as you can, and really consider yourself the expert on your child. The educators in the building, I'm a forever educator. I taught fourth grade. Like, I come into this space as like, we all need to work together to make this work. And everybody has their different areas of strength. But I will tell you, in most teacher training programs, they're not getting, detailed instruction on each exceptionality, or, they're not learning all of the things, all of the nuances of that. So you will often find yourself providing them with information that they may not say in the meeting they didn't know, but you will have to take on the role of not just educating yourself about your child's exceptionality, but also the other educators and people who come into contact with them. So that's my first big piece of advice, and like to just get comfortable in that. I think sometimes, I know for myself, when I initially started this journey, I felt kind of like a fish out of water. Like, I don't know, I'm just gonna like defer, they know what to do, like they do this, the special education coordinators here. I'm in a meeting with like 8 to 10 people. It's just me, like clearly they know. Right. And like ideally they know, but they don't. And so sometimes it's being comfortable asking questions, pushing back, asking for clarification, asking for people to show you where something is in the policy. I was watching one of your IG stories, and I was like, oh yeah, they'll always tell you, oh, we only can do this, or we only have this. And I always say, oh, I didn't know that. Can you show me where that is in your policy? Can you send me that policy? Can you, cite to the regulation that says that? Because again, as parents, like, I don't expect you to know the ins and outs of the IDEA. It's very nuanced. Like, I mean, I constantly go back and do continuous learning to like go back through it. I'm taking a course even right now just to like make sure I've like seen everything. There's a lot. So I don't want you to feel like you have to, be the master of like all of the laws, etc. Sometimes I put it back on them. Can you just send me that policy in writing, please? Yeah. And I think the other thing too is to just make sure that you're making requests in writing. If it's not in writing, I'll tell you as a lawyer, it didn't happen. And I will tell you, I have, prior to starting my own firm and representing parents and students exclusively, I represented school districts. Like, I've seen how this looks on the other side as well. So if you're making a request, you want an evaluation, you want someone to like review something, you want maybe like a one-on-one paraprofessional, you want extra time, etc. Make sure that you're making those requests in writing. If you're at IEP meetings, we as a rule at my firm, and when I'm coaching parents on advocacy, we just have a general rule that we always record. Sometimes it seems weird when you're like, I'm going to record this time and not that other time. Everyone's like, what's happening? But if you just do it and get in the habit of doing it all the time, it feels less weird. But you want to have a record of what happened to go back to, because sometimes the meeting minutes don't capture everything that you discussed. Sometimes all of your parental concerns don't get included in the document. And this is a legal document, your IEP, you guys are making an agreement that this is what's going to provide a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment for my child. So you just want to make sure that that document is accurate. And sometimes, having a recording for yourself, you just let the school know so that they can record as well. Just as helpful to be able to go back, because sometimes you're like, I know we talked about this, but suddenly like I don't see anything about what we've discussed. Yeah. And I think the other thing that I would say with that, with like having your own documentation, I always encourage parents, if you've had evaluations, make sure you have a copy of the evaluation, make sure you have copies of your IEP. You should be getting progress reports related to your IEP goals. So separate from the progress report or report card that comes out, that's just about, how your child is doing generally in school. You should be getting a progress report that says how they're doing specifically on the goals that you all decided are what's necessary for your child to access the general curriculum. And I can't tell you how many times parents are like, I've never gotten a progress report on that. I don't I don't know how those goals are doing. Or suddenly the goal just disappears, and I'm like, well, did he master it? I don't know. Like, there's no data for that. So do that. Make sure you're requesting those things if they're not being provided to you. And then the last thing, because again, when I was listening to your live, I was like, oh yeah, they'll always tell you, I don't do that, or we don't do that, or we don't have that program here, or, that's not our best practice. If they're going to deny, if you've made a request and they're going to deny that request, they're supposed to give you what we call prior written notice. So it's not sufficient to just be like, oh, we don't give a one-on-one para to kids in high school, or we don't do social skills for high schoolers, right? Okay. But if my child needs it, then the law says you're supposed to provide it. So if you're not going to provide it, then please send me the document that explains why you're not providing this, what research you looked at, what data you looked at that made you come up to that decision, rather than just being like, oh yeah, we can't do that, or we don't offer that here. If your child needs it, then you want to make sure that you're getting something.
I don't know if I froze or she froze. I don't know what happened. If you're here with me, we're just gonna wait a minute. We're smiling. Oh, hi.
Oh.
I don't know who that was, but I was just smiling.
But I was saying, I just said a mouthful, so definitely, ask any questions, or I'm happy to elaborate.
Was such, that last thing about when services are, Michelle just asked a good question. When services are not provided, having that documented, what you're saying is, to me, as a parent who has advocated for many IEPs, I hear a lot of times flippantly, we can't provide that. And I'm like, okay, but I have more questions here. So having them written down, it provides you with a document that you need in order to challenge the decision, but also it puts them to like, are you really going to sit here and put that on paper, or are you just telling me it hoping I don't ask again? So that's very valuable. So normally I don't have good questions, but let's answer some questions. How exciting. So Michelle asked, can parents challenge a decision not to provide a service?
You can. So your parental rights explain, if you disagree with the school, like what your options are. And so when you disagree, you can do a number of things. So you could file for due process to challenge that decision. You could file a complaint. You could request mediation. There are a number of things that you can do. Just because the school says no doesn't necessarily mean that that's where the conversation stops. One of the things that I would say that's also really important, I should have mentioned it also, is to make sure, again, that you have your documentation as well, that you're collecting data, or that the school is collecting data, so that we can be making these decisions based on data, not just what we can or can't do, which sometimes is really code for, that's not in our budget, like where, we can't afford that, we don't have someone to do that. None of those are legitimate excuses, but you want to make sure, again, that when you are challenging a decision, that you can point to data and evidence that suggests that your child needs whatever service or support. So, in addition to having, your evaluations and making sure that you can understand and interpret the evaluation and see what it does or does not actually show, and then along with all of the data that they're supposed to be collecting, you want to make sure that you have access to that as well. Yes. So if you don't have all that stuff right now, I don't know if I'm here or she's here.
The good part about what she's saying about getting the data is you can just be like, hey, so I'm updating my IEP binder and I noticed I didn't have this, and make it really benign, but like you're getting the data for your own documentation purpose. Oh, here, I don't know.
Oh no, I was just talking to you. I was going to say also with your data, when you're collecting and reviewing your data, it can be helpful to graph it, to put it on a chart and actually see, like, on this day he was, like maybe my child was at 68%, or the baseline is 60 and we're trying to get to 75, and like we're seeing that they're actually not making progress, or they are making progress and maybe it's time to move the goal forward. A lot of times schools will give you these things and say, we're going to have a year to get to this goal. And that may not always be appropriate. You know, if your child, it's like if the goal is baseline is 68 and the goal is 75, like they may be able to achieve that in 9 weeks. And
Yeah.
so, you know, really starting to look at like what we are collecting and how frequently collecting it, and then actually plotting out to see like how is my child actually progressing.
That's such a great point because I was just in a Facebook group the other day, like a local one, and somebody said, do I need to keep these IEPs for like ever? And I was like, yes. And my reasoning, besides the fact that I would want the documentation forever, is so that I could go back and see progress. If something came out like, okay, so maybe we had a regression even, and so I'm looking at like what we were doing at this grade versus what we're doing now. Like, I just want that. So, I mean, I've digitized everything, so I don't have a gigantic binder. But like, yes, I need copies of everything.
Yeah.
But that's such great advice.
And it's so helpful too, because I have seen kids who have had the same goal for like 3 years. And I'm like, at some
Oh
point,
yeah, yeah. As a foster parent, I get a lot of those IEPs. Yeah, yeah, it's
or
interesting.
suddenly a goal just disappears. And it's like,
Yeah,
what happened to speech? And it's like, no one can say why speech was there in 6th grade and it's no longer there in 7th grade. So I think it's helpful to have that for the story. I know when we take cases, we look for the full file. I want to see the
right.
whole story of what has been happening, so we can see, you know, what issues maybe have been swept under the rug or not fully addressed. And I would say that also if you have a child who has behavior goals, to also look at the data, request that data, track that data, make sure that if there's a behavior intervention plan, that people are actually doing the interventions and your child's not just getting in trouble because, you know, they're not actually following the behavior intervention plan.
Yeah, that's really hard when I've had kids before where I can't rely on their report back. Like it's just inconsistent information because their memory, and it's really hard for me to track whether or not someone's doing what they're asking to. But Jen asked, what about services that are only partially subsidized? Does the law state that services must be free, or does it depend on the state?
So the law says that you are entitled to a free, appropriate public education. So that means that depending on the types of services, if you need specific services related to your child's IEP, those should be at no additional cost to you. There may be things, so for example, if like every kid has to pay a locker fee, like may likely have to pay a locker fee. Just because you have an IEP, that doesn't mean that you wouldn't have to pay certain of those fees. But if it's related to a service, so say you need some sort of assistive technology, you should not have to come out of your pocket to pay for that assistive technology under the federal law. You are entitled to a free, appropriate public education. So if something is only partially subsidized, which is, I'm curious about the language of that, but
I know, I was thinking the same thing. I thought,
I don't know who's doing the subsidies there, but the local education agency should be making up that cost. You know, we've had issues sometimes where people, school districts might try to get you to have your insurance cover portions of that, and that may not always be appropriate under the law. So that would be a place where I would really push back and maybe ask for the policy or whatever. And sometimes asking that question allows people to know that, like, this parent,
you're a good question asker.
Yeah, we can't just say whatever. And I'll tell you, you know, every school district has an attorney. As attorneys, we're very risk adverse. Like, we don't want you to put anything in writing that's actually not legally sound. So if they can't produce a policy for you, that sometimes is an indication that maybe what they're saying isn't entirely accurate.
Yeah, I've had an education attorney, and I've worked with the district's education attorney, and so yes, I mean that, like in a meeting they'll be like, so yes, I agree with that. I'm super interested on the partially subsidized thing. I've not heard that before.
I am.
And
I'm really curious about that.
That sounds like something somebody said, probably over the phone. That would be the smarter
way. Right.
Don't let them call you all the time, guys.
Yes.
Can a student be allowed to catch up or make up work at a later date if they did not initially have an IEP?
Hmm. So I feel like that's a fact
Oh,
specific.
okay, hold on. This may be a continuation. If they have had a hard time completing assignments and are now failing while remote learning due to COVID.
Okay, and they did not have an IEP at the time?
That's what it sounds like. So, like, let me, if I were to make this a situation, I'm thinking like a kid that has ADHD, maybe they had a 504 for some accommodations, but at this point, we need some modifications because the amount of executive functioning required for virtual learning is just insane. So maybe that's what she means. Like, we have to change the. I mean, you could put that in a 504 too, right? The due date.
Mhm. Yeah, you
Time and
can
a half and
usually
stuff.
get additional time in your 504 plan. But let's say the child has
Nothing.
no plan, right? Like we just now saw that maybe he or she is eligible for special education services. And so I feel like um, there may be two ways to approach that. I don't know where you might be in the school year, if the quarter is already ended or not. But sometimes that's a great place even to start the conversation around the data. So the data shows that this child is failing. They're unable to do this work, which may be an indicator that they need some sort of accommodation either through a 504 plan or an IEP. And in those conversations, that may be a place where we say, hey, we're identifying that this child maybe needs to move through a process to determine whether they are eligible. And so we, maybe we'll give you some additional time to work and catch up this work. I will tell you one of the challenges with getting additional time to catch up or make up work, particularly for a child if they have executive functioning challenges, et cetera, is oftentimes they're also being asked to do new work. So then they end up with twice as much work to do, which can be really overwhelming. So I say, it may be on a case-by-case basis because maybe extra time to make up the work isn't necessarily the best approach moving forward. Maybe it's being strategic and thinking through which of these assignments actually help us get a clear indication on whether the child is able to master this concept. And so maybe we're modifying some of the work and not necessarily going to count all of the work or count all of the things that are missing as zeros, but we're going to be intentional about figuring out what information we need to get at this point in time so that the child can continue to progress. So I would say that would definitely be a conversation once and again, I don't know if you already have a 504 plan because your 504 plan may already include time and a half or extra time to complete work. And if you don't have any sort of additional support or plan put in place, then as you guys are going through this process to determine eligibility either for a 504 or an IEP, these could be different types of interventions that are put in place to assist the child.
That's great. So my cat it's cold, and so she hasn't left my side. As we were talking, it made me think of conversations I've had with several parents on this. There's the first attempt. I have not advocated to get a child an IEP. I have only had kids who have already had IEPs.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a different step that I have not done. So if, for example, we were trying to get an IEP and they're like, we're going to do a 504, but maybe like this kid is like a grade level behind on reading, several grade levels behind on math, has an IQ of 70. Like, at what point do we decide a 504 is not cutting it, and how do we properly advocate that with the school district when I'm assuming that they're wanting to keep at a 504 because of cost.
Mm-hmm.
But we need pull-out time. We need additional instruction. We need small group instruction for this child in order to help them be successful.
Yeah, absolutely. So school districts have the responsibility of child find. They are responsible for locating and identifying and evaluating any child who is or has reason to believe requires special education. And so special education in a lot of places is framed primarily as having an IEP and the services, et cetera, that comes under the IDEA. Section 504 provides certain protections, but it doesn't guarantee you like individualized education plan. So I have definitely seen sometimes parents will be like, oh, I think we need an evaluation. And they'll be like, okay, we'll just like create this 504 plan. So technically what you should know is that for both processes, there should be an evaluation. To actually get an IEP, there are certain categories that you have to fall into. So it's a little bit more, I don't know what the good word, I don't want to say restrictive, structure, it's a little bit. You can qualify for a 504 plan for a broad number of what we call disabilities under the Americans with Disabilities Act and its amendments. So if there's something that impacts your daily living, which education is one of those things, like you could potentially get a 504 plan for that. When you're getting an IEP, you actually have to meet a certain criteria for one of these 13 categories.
Like other health impairment, specific learning disability, that kind of stuff.
Right. And it usually requires, I shouldn't say usually, it requires that they do a comprehensive evaluation in all areas of suspected disability. So if you think there might be speech, they should have a speech evaluation. If you think you might need some occupational therapy, like there should be an OT therapy, right? Like an evaluation. They should be looking at all the areas of suspected disability to determine, whether the child is eligible for an IEP. What was the second part of your question?
Well, at what threshold do we say a 504 is not going to cut it? We need to like bump this up to an IEP.
Right. So let's say you have a 504 plan and the child is still not making progress. Like you're seeing these same issues are recurring. You keep collecting data. That's why I say, like it's really important to look and see like, okay, so we've been implementing these interventions in the 504, yet we're still seeing the same behaviors or the same, academic skills deficits. So you might go back to your 504 and say, hey, I think we need to do something else. You can always request an evaluation under the IDEA. I tell you, you need to do it in writing because that puts them on notice that there's reason to believe that the child may need an IEP. So if you've been going through a 504, you're not seeing progress, again, I think it's important to make sure you're keeping data. You can always request that your child be evaluated under the IDEA to determine whether they are eligible for an IEP.
That's helpful. In the couple cases I'm thinking of, I think it may have been which I had not thought of. Oh, don't worry, we'll take care of this with a 504. Maybe the evaluation part wasn't done. Because I feel like when you do evaluations for many of our kids, although because FASD is so dynamic, it's sometimes the evaluations don't capture it. So I've had people tell me, oh, that symptom you're telling me, they don't have that because I just tested them. I'm like, that was a good day then because they didn't have it. And so it's hard to kind of get that written down sometimes. But they were probably like, oh yes, we have this problem, so we're going to use a 504, but not having done the evaluation. And the evaluation would be a key factor in advocating for an IEP. Like you can't advocate for an IEP if the data is not there to support it. So that's such a good point.
And I will say that the 504, you're supposed to have an evaluation. I will tell you, a lot of times I see that step jumped over. So if you have an ADHD diagnosis, they'll be like, great, we'll just, bring us the diagnosis and we'll, make a 504 plan. If your child is diabetic and needs, certain insulin, et cetera, it's like, fine, we'll put it in a 504 plan, et cetera. But a lot of times, they're not doing a comprehensive evaluation to determine whether a 504 or an IEP is more appropriate.
Yeah, and the line being the modification and the like additional instruction periods. That's not provided in a 504. You're just getting accommodations. With an IEP, you're able to get like small group reading time that's above and beyond, and modification of work, which I think you can get extended time. Extended time is considered an accommodation.
An accommodation.
But like if you're not on grade level, then I can hand you multiplication sheets all day. But if you're still working on addition, that doesn't do us any good. So
right.
So yeah, okay. Well, I told you 15 minutes, so thank you so much. Well, yeah, but people ask like really good questions. Sometimes when I I don't know. This is a topic that is very nuanced, and it can be like one of the most frustrating things that you work with as a parent. I know it definitely makes many of us feel not seen, and I know you have felt like that. Like, okay, so I'm the crazy one because there's all these people with degrees, as you said, in this room telling me that this isn't real. And so I think sometimes it makes us question our parenting, like, oh my gosh, the teacher is like a better parent than I am because I have this stuff happen all the time. But the reality is it's just so much more complex than that. So awesome. Okay, so people can connect with you on your Instagram. You're very active on your Instagram, which I love. But what other things should they know about you?
Yeah, so I am actually, hopefully in the middle of November, I'm going to be launching a special education advocacy course for parents. Really kind of walking through like, what are your parental rights? Like, make sure that you know and understand them and you understand how to use them. And also a lot of the softer points around advocating. Like I always tell people, when you bring a lawyer in, it makes things very adversarial. And so I always think like that's the last, the last step. But there are ways to think like a lawyer, to like take this knowledge and put it into a framework and actually be able to move forward and solve some of your problems in a way that is more efficient and more effective for you as a parent, and also to do that around other parents. I really feel like special education is a team sport. And when you go to the IEP meetings or, 504 meetings, it's like the school has their team and you kind of walk in and it's like everybody's already been in the meeting room and you're kind of like, what did I miss? Like, did I miss the meeting? So I think it's really important to have a community of other parents and caregivers who are going through the same experience. And so that's something coming up. I definitely would love feedback, even a pilot group to just kind of talk about what are the areas of parent advocacy that are most tricky or troubling, so we can really design a course that's very helpful and effective for parents. In the meantime, I have a digital community, and we are in there like to share resources and grow together. And so you can join that if you text EdLaw to 33777. And I'll actually give you one of my freebies, which is a framework for even thinking through how to address a issue that comes up in your parent advocacy. So I have a 5-step framework. It's probably going to become 6 steps soon because the paperwork piece.
We're always learning.
There's the paperwork piece, but it's really important, to like make sure you understand your rights, that you're figuring out how you influence, that you have a clear vision for what you want your child to be able to do and accomplish and feel and experience. Because I will tell you, if you don't have a vision for where you want your child to go, they could end up anywhere. And so I talk a lot about getting the school on board with your vision for your child so that they see them as more than whatever disability they may have, right? Our kids come with so many strengths, so many talents, so much value, and sometimes they get reduced to the smallest aspect of themselves, and we as caregivers, parents, have to be that voice. So if you text EdLaw to 33777, you can get that framework and you can join our online digital community of just parents, caretakers, other individuals who just want to make sure that every child, regardless of their race, their class, their sex, or their ability, has the opportunity to meet their limitless potential and receive an excellent education experience. And so that's what we are about at the F Young Firm, and we're really leaning into advocacy and growing together because we as parents and caregivers are the best situated to advocate for our own children and to hold the school systems accountable for providing an education to everyone.
Yes, I agree. And I think you brought up a really good point in that the law may states that things be applied equitably, but that's not always what happens. And so whenever I have, I'm a foster parent, so I get kids that come to me, they have IEPs, and I'm like, why is this child that has this level of need in an inclusion setting? Like, we know that's not the right option, but you just thought I wasn't going to pay attention. These kinds of situations make me really sad for our kids whose parents don't have all the privilege that I do in order to be able to have the time and the money, in the case of me hiring a lawyer, to advocate, in addition to the fact that I walk in the room and I look like everybody else that's in the meeting. Like that, I have so many privileges that I bring to an IEP meeting, and I still have been like, what just happened here? So,
Yeah.
so for those kids who don't have parents that can do all of that, not that they don't want the best for them, it's incredibly time consuming. We have to continue to make sure that our voices are heard and our kids are seen for the entirety of who they are, and not just,
Yeah.
the reports that we get home on behavior usually.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think the community piece is so important to you. Even what you were saying earlier is like, am I a bad parent? Am I just like doing this all the way wrong? I can't tell you the number of times I've had a consultation, or we do what we call Amplify Ed Success Map. And so we kind of like list out and go through a process of figuring out like where your child is, where we want them to go, and like what are the supports and things that would be helpful to get them there. Like, does that mean they need a 504? Do they need an IEP? Do we need to change the services in the IEP? Are there any outside activities, clubs, etc., that maybe would be beneficial to teach some of these other skills that they can't necessarily get in school, especially now in this virtual setting as well, because not all the services that our children need are actually being provided in that virtual setting, and that raises a lot of concerns, or they're being pushed back onto parents to figure it out. Like, you teach your kids social skills, and I'm like, there's only so many of us here. Like,
well, and I find they listen a lot more when someone else is involved. I'm just like, I've said that a million times, but they're like, really, that's so interesting. I'm like,
I know my oldest, he throws a lot of shade all the time. I'm like, I know I told you that. And then he'll be like, oh, so Mr. So-and-so said this, that, and the other. And I'm like, I know I said that.
Sometimes you have to be like, oh, that's so interesting. Yeah. What great advice you got.
Right. I think, again, like I said earlier, like, kudos to you for having this page. I think it's so important that people know that other people are going through these experiences too, and that sometimes they are similar. And I always tell people, I'm like, it's not comforting to know that, you're not the first family who you advocated and the school like called the Department of Family and Children Services on you. Like, that happens a lot. Like, you're not a terrible parent. You haven't done something wrong. And sometimes it just helps to know that, like, sometimes these are the tactics, or these are the types of hurdles that we run into, and like, how do we power through? And I just think, again, there's safety in numbers. And so I just encourage people, if you have a child who learns or behaves differently, to get connected with other groups. There's so many different Facebook groups, so many places where you can access resources, sometimes too many, so it can get overwhelming, I will say that. But I just think it's important to plug in, because you're not alone and you're not terrible at what you're doing. We just are really fighting a system that wasn't set up to accommodate our children. Like, we have a whole body of law that says you have to educate our children, because we used to just institutionalize them or not send them to school. So you're fighting up a mountain, but you have all the resources are available, and we just want to make sure that we're helping parents and families and children really access those things and have a better experience through this process and better outcomes.
Oh, for sure, for sure. Thank you so much. You are a gem and a huge resource. I'm hoping people will follow you. But I'm also excited about your course, so I will update everybody when that comes out. But thank you, and I will post this on my page so we can share.
Awesome. Thanks. Have a great rest of your Sunday.